l'infinité de l'univers auquel il tente de donner la parole, notamment grâce à des outils numériques. Et sa proposition s'intitule A World Inhabiting Itself, et il s'agit d'un projet né en 2018 et qui interroge la possibilité de totalisation du monde, préoccupation qui est au cœur, on le sait, de la cosmologie depuis l'Antiquité. Voilà, donc nous avons hâte de découvrir vos travaux et je vous laisse la parole.
Merci Pamela, et je voudrais vous remercier et remercier Alexandre aussi pour m'avoir inclus dans cette série de séminaires qui était très intéressante. Je voudrais partager avec vous mon écran. Est-ce que c'est possible de le faire?
Je vous autorise à le faire. Voilà, vous pouvez le faire maintenant.
Ok, d'accord. Alors, bon, en tout cas, je vais finir par essayer de trouver ces commandes. Bon, en tout cas,
vous avez une icône en vert marquée partager l'écran au milieu de la barre, en plein milieu. Voilà.
Et voilà, merci. Et voilà, ok, d'accord. Alors, le projet sur lequel je vais travailler, I'm going to switch to English because basically that's the language I think in. Apologies to my French friends. So the project I'm working on is called A World Inhabiting Itself. It's an artistic project based on a number of ideas, including the idea that self-description, meaning identity, is basically the attempt at self-coincidence. And the idea that the world's self-coincidence and representations as element of the world resists all definition. It resists all definition through its escape towards infinity. And this is what I will be trying to illustrate in this work. Basically, what we see is that infinity has frequently been used as a means of world negation. It's been used by the Greeks and by the Romans as a means of destroying a particular form of world description, of a particular description of the world. So essentially as a destruction of a world, of a particular world. Why? Well, within Greco-Roman thinking, there is a current that sees infinity as a manifestation of the undefinable, of the apeiron, a negation of the order underlying our very ability to describe the world. And of course, the use of infinity and the use of the apeiron as a criticism is based on some basic assumptions. First is that an undescribable world cannot exist. And a destruction of a particular world description implies that a world of this particular form cannot exist. So that use of the apparently, that we will be discussing, apparently paradoxical aspects of infinity have been, in fact, means of destruction of certain world descriptions. And in fact, this is also based on an assumption formulated by Aristotle, which is that being infinite is a privation. It's something missing. It's not a perfection, but an absence of a limit. It's an absence. And for the Greek, the limit is what creates our ability to describe the world. The limitations are what creates the cosmos as an order, as an ordered world, as opposed to chaos, of course. So, of course, one of the most famous of these, and is in the probably one of the greatest mind experiments in history, is Zenon's series of paradoxes, of which I believe 9 have remained, and of which he wrote actually 40 of these, and only 9 remains today. So the most famous, of course, is the dichotomy paradox, the famous race between Achilles and the tortoise, and the second is the paradox of the arrow. And these paradoxes are used as the means of negating one of the fundamental intuitions of our world description, which is temporality. So that by doing this, in effect, he is destroying a particular description, I mean, radically destroying a particular description of the world. The arrow, the flying, the idea is that one of his beautiful aphorisms is that a flying arrow is at rest. So that every instant describing the arrow implies its spatial self-coincidence, is that in effect every instant is describing the arrow, every instance of a temporality, of what he considers to be the illusion of temporality. Every instant implies the self-coincidence, the spatial self-coincidence of the arrow with itself, thus negating temporality. The implication, of course, is that spatiality, the spatial, is the negation of temporality. Of course, this is a position that will later be refuted by Galileo in his Galilean relativity, but Galileo himself reflects the position of Zeno when he says, movement is nothing, le mouvement est rien. This, in fact, use of infinity as a negation of particular world description is also, we also find it in the work of Lucretius in De Rerum Natura. And this is what he says. In fact, using infinity as a demonstration through the absurd, reductio ad absurdum, démonstration par l'absurde. This is what he says. Moreover, there is not a minimum. The smallest bodies would have infinites. Since then, half of a half could still be halved, with limited divisions less and less than what the then he asks, what the difference between the sum and the least, between the greatest and the smallest? None. However, for however the sum, even the smallest, will consist of the same amount of infinite parts. What does this mean? Well, to synthesize what it means, an infinitely divisible world would imply this exact same amount of information on every level. It would be a negation of a basic constituent of our world description, meaning the difference between the large and the small. And a negation between the large and the small is, of course, a negation of proportions. And proportions are one of the basic foundations of geometry, of our geometrical understanding of the world. So that we would be, in fact, destroying the geometry of the world. Furthermore, this would imply a destruction of any hierarchically organized representation of reality. And this hierarchy is not, of course, simply related to social organization. It's also related to knowledge. We, in very many instances, organize our knowledge of the world hierarchically. So this view of infinity as privation, as an absence is transformed under the influence of Plotinus, of course, with Augustine's view towards something different. The apeiron, the undefinable of infinity, is transformed into a description of essentially transcendence of God, of what he considers God. So in that sense, he expresses a change in the view of infinity from world negation to an indication of God's transcendence. And in our more modern definition of the gods, we are in fact much closer to his view of divinity as we would be to, for instance, Plato's definition of infinity, which where he considers the good to be limited, to be a very definition of the good would be its limitation. So even in the case of Augustine, by the way, infinity is still considered as a failure of description, but said failure is considered as the expression of God's transcendence and of the world and humanity's limitation in relation to it. This is, of course, what we see in paintings of the Renaissance and of the Baroque era, where the vanishing point of perspective, which is when you're creating a three-dimensional illusion, there's something in perspective called the vanishing point, and where all the parallel lines meet. So essentially, the vanishing point is placed, as you would notice here, by Leonardo, right in the middle of the head of his divinity, of Christ. So that, in effect, the vanishing point, which is infinitesimally small, so that it, in fact, escapes any definition by becoming smaller and smaller, is the divinity, but it's also the anchor of the world's order. The whole order of this painting is anchored to this point. This is done, in effect, probably more spectacularly, not necessarily better, but more spectacularly, of course, by Andrea Pozzo in a technique called quadratura. And the painting and the fresco that you see here is basically a flat, well, it's a ceiling. And it's called the Apotheosis of St. Ignatius. And it's basically the movement towards the infinitely distant point, and this is St. Ignatius here. And upon this infinitely distant point, we see the representation of Christ and God the Father. So that the organization of reality in relation to infinity is frequently, narratively and symbolically, and structurally, by the way, posited as the expression of divine perfection, of the world organized in relation to divine perfection. So that the movement of the painting is tending towards a remoteness assumed as infinite. This, of course, leads us to Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, with its self-referential form of infinity. Basically, and it's called, the word mise en abîme is internationalized now. It's a mise en abîme. And basically, what Diego Velázquez here is painting is what we see here in front of us. Why? Well, for the very simple reason that that Diego Velázquez is looking at a mirror. So that what Diego Velázquez is painting here is this. So this is this. So this painting contains a painting. This paintings which contain a painting of Diego Velázquez painting contains a painting of Diego Velázquez painting, contains a painting of Diego Velázquez painting, etc., etc., etc. It's in fact a self-referential infinity. In the world inhabiting itself, we base ourselves on one form of self-referential infinity. The project starts with the geometrical process as its foundation. The foundation is 12 artworks in a relationship of infinite mutual containment. And I will explain how that is. These are the 12 artwork. So let's consider this to be artwork 1 here. Artwork 1 contains artwork 2, which contains artwork 3, 4, 5, 11, and 12. which leads to an infinite loop of mutual containment, meaning 1 contains 2 to 12, 2 contains 3 to 1, 3 contains 4 to 2, 12 contains 12 to 1, which leads to containment of containment, meaning 1 contains the 2, that contains the 3, 4, 5, 6, and the 1. So it contains the painting that contains it. 2 contains 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, and 2. So 2 contains 3, which contains it. 3, etc. Right? And all of them are, in effect, in a circular relationship. So there is no hierarchy between them. Which leads us, in effect, to containment of containment of containment ad infinitum. 1 containing 2, which contains 3, which contains 4, which contains the 1 containing 2, which contains 3, which contains, etc., etc., etc. So, in effect, each image starts with the image before it, so that, in effect, each image is self-referencing every other image. And the initial image then goes through aesthetic, intuitive manipulation in order, hopefully, to escape mathematical formalism. I will play this video. I'll play 1 minute of it. The technical work was done by Bassem Daouk, and he's the musician who organized the Bach's. I use Bach's canon, never-ending canon, in the musical offering, precisely because it has this circularity. So this is. So I'll stop here because of our limitation of time. So what we see here is that every statement, meaning every painting, contains the totality of all other statements, including the ones pertaining to itself. So the form of infinite mutual containment is proposed intuitively and fully hypothetically as the expression of an underlying principle determining consciousness as a world-building activity. World-building, of course, as a reflection of ourselves within the world. We are essentially representational world builders. And the self-coincidence as the foundation of our comprehension of the world is fundamentally incomprehensible as expression of totality, because it infinitely escapes its own self-containment towards an infinitesimal point. Then this is what I was hoping to express in these paintings. From within this representation, the time and space of this representation's perceptions are only partial manifestations of its interiority. No external view is possible because the very act of exteriority, the passage from one artwork to the other, implies an infinitely self-escaping, fugal self-containment. And every artwork as an instant of perception contains all the artworks as past and future instances. And this is a conception of both time and every instant of time as containing all of the information about the past and potential futures. What this means is a conception of time where every instant is a situated reflection of the totality of all other instants. Based on this process of mutual containment, I compose interrelated variations. Within this interrelated variations, two other elements came. Is that first I accepted an exteriority to the interior circular structure, and then I added the issue of the integration of text, the integration of aphorisms that I constantly write, which are themselves word descriptions. So what was here is the attempt to combine text and images, two of our basic forms of human representation of the world, and a sort of conversing two forms among themselves. The basic model, of course, is the fugue, which is a deeply geometric musical form, deflecting the auto-reflective characteristics behind the emergence and the activity of consciousness. The fugue as essentially is viewed here as patterns reflecting each other and as angled reflections of their own mutual reflections. So that akin to the fugue, I create processes determining geometrical variation within which intuitive aesthetic choices occur as pattern creation, self-similarity, and recursion. And in this, perhaps, hopefully, imitating the emergence of self-consciousness at the world anchor. Similar process based on circular forms determines a related series of artworks. And these artworks, in fact, are not separate from the project. This is a continuity of this. They are, in fact, they enter in conversation with each other. And this is, in fact, the artwork I am working on right now. So, what was the objective of all of this? The objective was the contemplation and expression of what is, which is basically the undefinable place, the apeiron, where the world both differs from and coincides with itself, a state reflected by consciousness's constant inability to coincide with itself, given that any self-description as an attempt at self-coincidence is a partial framing of a totality assumed as the very condition of description. Is a partial division of a totality assumed as the very condition of description. And divided totality is no longer totality. And what the project hoped to do was imply a circularity between description and described as the condition of description. The act of creating the world that is creating us. Thank you.